In the areas of emergency response, school districts use many tools: reviewing of existing plans, interaction with first responders, planning with law enforcement. These tools allow us to be better prepared. In the video that you are about to see from Homeland Security, called 480 Seconds, may give you some additional tools, not only in school, but in your everyday life.
No, es que no me entienden, amiga, está bien.
Do you know anybody in the building?
Sí, amiga.
480 seconds.
What?
480 seconds. The average length of an active shooter incident.
8 minutes. Good to know.
Why don't you start over there and I'll work this side of the scene.
Okay.
I'm Detective Lambert with the police department. We're just trying to figure out what happened here this morning. Were you in the building during the incident?
Yeah, I was there.
And your name?
Terrence. Terrence Groves.
Mr. Groves, did you happen to see the shooter?
No, I mean, I heard someone say that it could have been a vendor or something, but nobody knows for sure.
So tell me what happened.
I'm just sitting at my desk and I heard what I thought sounded like gunshots followed by a lot of screaming. And it sounded like it was all coming from a different part of the office. So I just I left my briefcase there and I just got out of there off the floor as soon as I could. And I was trying to lead others, but if they paused and if they hesitated, I didn't stop for them at all. So when I finally got outside to safety, I called 911.
Yeah, well, getting out while you could, leaving your stuff behind, not slowing down for anyone who hesitated. Smart. Thank you, Mr. Groves. If you can think of anything else, please give me a call.
Thanks. I will.
In the areas of violence prevention, we'd like to raise awareness of potential risk factors and indicators for targeted violence in schools. Some of these risk factors: intense anger, mental illness, family-based discord, abuse, neglect, parental absence, previously disciplinary actions. These risk factors are not necessarily predictive of a radicalization to violence. One or more of these risk factors, it may empower your community to be proactive in engaging in prevention programs. There are many indicators that are involved in this. An indicator is behavior that suggests an individual has already radicalized to violence. Some of these indicators can be something such as expressed intent to carry out an attack, including threats on social media, planning attack, and threatening a target. But a few key statistics. As you can see on the screen, there are multiple statistics that are important, including 80% of school attackers were bullied by their classmates. Some of them, when they sought help, received ineffective or no response at all. 51% of school attackers had engaged in observable planning behaviors prior to the attack. And 94% of school attacks had experienced a risk factor within 6 months of their attack. COVID-19 has increased the exposure to potential risk factors. 30% of respondents between the age of 13 and 19 reported unhappy or depressed, with nearly as many reporting they worried about having some basic needs met, such as food, medicine, and safety. 29% of the respondents did not feel connected to the school adults, with nearly as many reporting they don't feel connected to their classmates or their community. Anecdotal evidence also suggests students have experienced an increase in cyberbullying. Millions of students relied on schools for mental health resources and access to mental health professionals. These resources were either severely restricted or terminated as schools moved to online instruction. Having one or more potential risk factors does not mean that a student will be engaged in violence or terrorism, and that risk factors are not predictive, but they certainly can give you an idea of some of the issues that you may need to address inside your community. A school is a total community. Whether you're a student, a staff member, parent, or other members of the broader community, you are all bystanders. That is someone who is aware of some concerning behaviors of either another staff member, a colleague, a student, and in order to be engaged, members of those communities need to know how to find help for individuals who may be radicalized to violence. Dr. Jane Halliday Goldman is the Program Service Director for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Recently, in an interview, she was asked, is there an impact socially or economically to violence prevention?
Huge, and there's some interesting studies. It's very hard to measure, but we do know that our systems, our adult justice system, our hospitals, and our adult mental health systems are full of people with untreated child trauma. And the amount of, it's amazing. I mean, you know, the seminal study was the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which shows the link. And this is correlation, not causation. So it shows a link between people who have and it was a limited list of 10 things. It was not the same list that many of us in the field would have created, but this was still seminal work. So people who had 4 or more of these traumas were much more likely to have cancer, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, also more likely to engage in smoking and substance use and substance abuse issues. Many of those as probably a way to cope with the symptoms that they didn't understand came from the trauma, or maybe they did understand it, but they weren't able to access the treatment for it at the time. So the financial cost is extraordinary. So treating child trauma, to me, I mean, it's all I do and look at every day. So I think it's the most important thing. I do understand there's a lot of other important things to focus on, and education being one of them. But that's the thing, right? You can't even focus. A child who is going through trauma, many of them cannot even focus on education. Some might focus on it and as an exclusion to everything else, as a distraction, and might, be good because do really well because of that. But, it can affect your ability to pay attention, to take in information, so many things, to even just physically sit in a seat. There's a lot more research since then, which kind of understands the pathways that go from that trauma to all of the things that can happen later on. There's physiological changes in our body because of it. We now know that we can actually pass some of those on to our kids, that there's epigenetic changes, that changes things in our genes at times. So I can't stress enough how important it is to deal with the trauma because of all of those factors that come later on. And also, I think one of the hardest things, I think I was raised in upstate New York in a small town. I've got that bootstrap mentality, right? Like, I did it all on my own. I came here, I got a PhD. But I so get that, but still people who do that still struggle, and nobody needs to struggle alone. And, you can know a lot about a lot of things, but the way this impacts us is really, really hard to tease apart. And people do study for years to be able to help with that. And it doesn't mean even that therapy is exactly what everybody needs. I think it can be great, and there's some really good treatments. But people need to have the ability to connect with other people and form relationships. And that is one thing that is often damaged because of trauma.
As a nonprofit agency, we advocate for legislative agendas and changes. We do trainings, educational opportunities. We do everything from hosting legislative days to get young individuals, young folks, students engaged in the legislative and advocacy process. We do workforce development for adults around mental health issues. Where I see us, and when I speak us now, I'm going to kind of speak in general in terms of the MHAs across New York State. I think where we are at this point is a place of openness and uncertainty and a sense of possibility. I think, if I go back to 2018, 2019, early 20s, like I think about the year and a half leading into the pandemic, many of our agencies, and I think Mahaney as a whole, oftentimes we're kind of preaching to the choir in some ways, and that getting the message out around the importance of mental health, not only in schools and in workplaces, but just in general. There were those people who were on board with our messaging and on board with this call, and really were supporting us and supporting our agencies. And unfortunately, I think it took a pandemic for our broader society to realize that mental health is not something that can be relegated to, seriously ill people, or that mental health is something that we just don't talk about, or mental health is something that is stigmatized, in a way that we realize that mental health is part of a continuum, and that we all have experienced some sort of stress, anxiety, depression. We've all experienced some level of trauma, regardless of how our lives have been impacted by COVID. If we've been fortunate enough to kind of only see the effects from a TV screen, all the way to sort of frontline workers, people who've lost family and friends, I think we all have been impacted by this. And I think our society at this moment is realizing that kind of the old way of sort of separating out sort of mental health, physical health, and just the way that we treat our students, our workers, our colleagues, our friends, our neighbors. I think we have a renewed opportunity to really reshape the way we talk about mental health, I think throughout our state, but really throughout our country. I'll use the bus driver as an example, because I hear you talking around sort of maybe some issues at home, but I'm also thinking the bus, when I was growing up, that could have been, there was some bullying going on buses, right? The bus ride wasn't necessarily fun for everybody. And the bus driver in that moment, their role is to get the kids safely from point A to point B. But to your point, how do we sort of realize that there are a lot of people in our educational system and in our schools that have contact with kids? And so is there a way that you can create specific opportunities to talk with those individuals, to say, hey, what are you seeing? Are you how have you noticed anything? Have you heard anything, right? And instead of waiting for that bus driver, waiting for that food service person, or for that coach to come forward, or whoever that person is, instead of waiting for them to come forward, being intentional, right? And saying, hey, whether that's creating a roster and sort of knowing, okay, these kids are on buses and I want to check in with these bus drivers on an occasional basis, or however that might look. I understand the structure is probably like, oh my gosh, how would we even sort of go about doing that? But I think that there has to be a way to create an avenue that says, we care about these kids, we care about what their context is, and we want to get a better sense of what their total educational experience is like, not just in the classroom. Share just one thing that really highlights what I think our young folks are going through. And what they've gone through and what they will continue to go through is, it's one thing for us as adults, right? It's fine. I'm like, oh, I don't need to celebrate that. It's fine. 40 something. I don't need to worry about that birthday. But for young folks, especially for adolescents, social connection and their place in the world and how they differentiate themselves is part of their development, is part of their human development. And the past year and a half has not offered the majority of our youth and adolescents the opportunity to develop in that usual way. And so I would encourage, and I'm encouraging myself and my colleagues and my friends, to not necessarily dismiss some of the things that we see as, oh, well, that's fine. You'll get, it was just you'll have another birthday, or you'll have another whatever. That these are really important social markers and social opportunities, because that's when we as human beings in those adolescent years make sense of our place in the world, our identities, what we see as our values, what's right, what's wrong. And what our schools need to be able to do is both educate and create a space for those social connections to happen in meaningful, authentic ways, and to sort of almost in some ways, I think as school starts to hold that up maybe a little bit higher. Most of the educational professionals that I've been talking to or hearing from believe that for the majority of our students, any educational loss, any lapses in learning will be made up. That's for the majority of our students. There are certainly those that there are going to be challenges, but I'm speaking to the majority. But what can't be made up is that sense of social loss. And so what do we need to do to really acknowledge that, and to step back and to realize that, I don't know, I can't imagine what it would have been like to have been in high school this past year. And so I think that that's my kind of what I would want to learn from the students, right? So learn from them. What was this like for you? What do you need? And how can I help you?
We'd like to believe that children get over it. That over time, children forget. Child trauma is a tragedy that occurs each and every day in America. And for its victims, recovery and resilience are anything but guaranteed. Often the scars become a permanent part of who they are. And child trauma becomes lifelong trauma. But now there is hope. SAMHSA's National Child Traumatic Stress Network and its partners are changing the course of children's lives by changing the course of their care. Now, with your help, even those with the darkest past can enjoy a brighter future.
Being aware or realizing the widespread impact of trauma and the many ways that can buffer that and lead to recovery, recognizing trauma signs and symptoms. And that's really about everybody, hopefully down to the students and families, but certainly the educators, the administrators, and the other school staff that have a lot of interaction. School bus drivers, recess or lunch monitors, really kind of everybody understanding the signs and symptoms of trauma. Responding in a way that kind of integrates knowledge about trauma into all aspects of the system. Having trauma-informed classrooms, having places where somebody can go when they're having difficulty regulating their behaviors or their emotions, and having kind of some discipline strategies in the classroom and in the further stages that really understand that many behaviors that children are exhibiting probably that trauma or mental health or other learning issues could be at play, and so thinking about more appropriate response measures to deal with that. And then resisting the re-traumatization of people who've already been impacted by trauma. So by doing things like decreasing the occurrence of triggers of trauma and loss reminders, implementing trauma-informed policies. And I'm kind of answering the question by saying the word trauma-informed a lot, which I know is tricky. But we do have a framework that we created, and we're in the process of developing more specific implementation guidelines for how you do this. But we do have a lot of tools, and we have a lot of sites that specialize in trauma-informed schools. So we do have a lot of strategies that have, for different aspects of our framework, like creating a trauma-informed classroom, for example, or creating a trauma-informed discipline strategy. We'd be happy to share some more, but it's really, I think the biggest thing is just understanding the impact of trauma on kids and families and the people in the school system, the adults in the school system too. And then having a plan and really a multi-tiered approach. I think that's a language that schools often understand really well. So you do some things for everybody, but you have a way of identifying who might need a little bit more support. And there's some of that can also be provided in the schools. And then some kids are going to need a lot more support. And there's things that, you can then reach into the community and have hopefully relationships with providers who can really kind of help to do some of the deeper work, because schools are not mental health providers. But there's so much that can really help support a student and other members of the school community support their mental health. I think in general, we talked mostly about maltreatment, so various forms of abuse. We talked a lot about disasters, the school shootings you mentioned, fires, hurricanes, all those kinds of things that you mentioned. And then especially in my program, we talked about a lot about systemic trauma. So thinking about kids in child welfare and juvenile justice, even some of the things that happen within a school system, bullying, et cetera, that can really impact a child and the responses to all of those things. So I think those are probably the biggest things that we focused on. But again, it really varied. Now, I think grief and loss is a big thing. I think people lost people for sure during COVID. And there was also, a loss of a lot of the things that helped make kids feel safe and protected. A lot of times schools provided that for kids. Some of the adults, whether it's their sporting team or another activity they had or a teacher that they were close with, really, gave kids a sense of safety and hope and another outlet for things. Also things like sports or participating in community, maybe a faith-based community, really helped build people's resilience, and it gave them what they needed, which connection, support, a sense of being able to do something in the world. So all of those things were lost too. So, trauma is a lot about that. Coping from trauma is bad things happen to everybody. Sometimes people have a lot of resilience and protective factors, and they're able to cope better than others. So a lot of those protective factors were taken out of the equation. And then the increase of suicidality is certainly something we're talking about now. Adolescent suicide rates are astronomically higher than they've ever been. And then that probably goes along with another thing we're talking about now, and it's in general mental health symptoms. So we're seeing an increase in things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders. Certainly, there's more awareness and of things around racial trauma and abuse. So we're also working a lot more in those areas. There's also seems to be more of an understanding of how issues of race, gender, sexual orientation, identity, how that all intersects with trauma. So that's, I would say, a lot of what the focus is now. We really strongly suspected that we would see a lot more maltreatment, and that has not shown up. And I think that's important. I think it's an important thing for schools to think about, for all of us to think about, because it could be that, nobody has talked to there hasn't been a safe place to disclose some of that. So it's possible that we'll see some of that, and it'll probably take a while to tease it out. But it's also possible that, that it's not, that we were maybe intervening in places where we shouldn't beforehand, or that taking out some of the other things going on. I mean, certainly there's increased financial stressors in a lot of homes because of COVID, and that often does lead to maltreatment. But at the same time, sometimes maybe having more time together as a family, more time to do some of the things that strengthen families, that could also have decreased maltreatment. So we don't know the reason and fully understand that yet, but that is something that certainly has happened, and there's been some terrible incidents of it, but there has overall been a decrease, certainly of reported incidents in the country. Absolutely. I think it's probably the cornerstone to any of this work, because you can't help anybody else when you're experiencing some of the same things. And something like secondary traumatic stress, it's exactly the same symptoms as traumatic stress. It's from hearing the emotional toll that it takes from hearing the stories that you're hearing from others. So there are a lot of different things. It's important to remember that when some of your normal self-care strategies aren't working, that there are people to help with that too. And adults need care and mental health care. And there's a lot of now telemental health for adults as well. So if you're not in a place that has access to good folks nearby, that's an option. So always keep that in mind, and to know that it's actually really normal to have some of these symptoms. So it doesn't feel normal to maybe feel really irritated, maybe really exhausted all the time. Maybe you can't stop thinking about some of these stories that you're hearing. All of this feels abnormal, makes feel like they're not well, but it is normal when you're doing that kind of work. Oh, it's such a great thing to be able to talk about. I also learned recently that Simone Biles was a foster care youth. So it's extremely likely that she has a history of trauma in her life. And also extremely likely that she learned some really good coping skills. She learned how to take care of herself. And what a different world it was. I mean, when I remember, I think about Michael Jordan playing with like 103-degree fever, which could kill somebody, right? It's not really a good idea. Certainly, Carrie Shrug, am I saying that right? Playing with an injury and winning the goal. It is amazing, and it is certainly resilience. But understanding that there's a mental health resilience piece to that too, right? Like that there are some kids that are coming to school with serious injuries, even if they're internal and you can't see. And it's sometimes just extraordinary that they get through the day, that they can make a friend, that they can take a test. It really is amazing. So thinking about some of those physical struggles and emotional struggles and how similar they are, and talking about folks like Simone Biles, who was like, wow, I'm really not going to I really can't do this right now. And I know what I need a break. And that she was able to say that, and then that people were able to support her for it. And maybe not everybody did, which is also important to talk about, but most people did, and her coaches did, and her teammates did. And I think it's a good way to talk about why this is a priority. I think many things about COVID also destigmatized a lot of things about mental health. So I hope it creates more conversation. It creates more ability to talk about, you know, how you're feeling and how that is affecting your work. You know, even if you're not, you know, on a high beam, or it's, you know, it affects your ability to take a test or to pay attention in class, or to make a friend. And so it really is it's a nice platform for being able to talk about that, I think.